Hello and welcome to an India Today special broadcast. I'm Gaurav Sawant. Russian President Vladimir Putin has thanked the people of Russia and the security forces for handling the situation effectively during the rebellion by the Wagner forces. The Russian president thanked the military personnel, saying they were the real defenders in very difficult times and stood in the way of the unrest. Had they not done so, there would have been chaos. He said, and I quote, "You actually stopped the civil war, acted clearly and in harmony. Your determination and courage, as well as consolidation of society, played a decisive role in the suppression of the rebellion." He then went on to say that Russia did not have to remove combat units during this attempted mutiny. The people and the army were not with the rebels. President Putin thanked the entire personnel of the armed forces, law enforcement agencies, the special services for their courage, their valor, and their loyalty to the people of Russia. Before I get you much more on this big story where questions are being asked whether President Putin remains completely in control or are mercenary forces now increasingly becoming more powerful in Russia, let's quickly cut across and listen in to the Russian president before I get you more on this latest developments on this big story.
You have acted firmly and harmoniously in a difficult situation. You have proved with deeds your loyalty to Russian people and military oath. You showed responsibility for motherland's fate and future.
Нам не пришлось снимать боевых подразделений.
So is it now clear that the mutiny by the Wagner forces has completely been decimated? The fact that Prigozhin, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner forces, according to reports, is already in Belarus. Most of the Wagner fighters have gone back to their units either in eastern Ukraine, or others have been given an option. They could sign a contract, join the forces, that is the Russian forces, report to the Ministry of Defense as part of a contract, or they can move to Belarus and be with the forces in Belarus. I quickly want to cut across to India Today's Abhishek Bhalla, who's keeping a hawk eye on developments in Russia and in Ukraine. Abhishek, does this weaken the Russian president, or has he established his authority completely? And we'll show our viewers those images of that meeting that took place in Kremlin. But what does this also mean for the Wagner forces?
Gaurav, first of all, a big sigh of relief for the Russian people, I think, and also for President Putin, because, you know, when he says that this was heading towards being a civil war, then he's clearly acknowledging the kind of dangers this rebellion had, and this mutiny in fact reached just 200 kilometers south of Moscow. So it's not as if they were thousands of kilometers away. The fact that they could reach mainland Russia up to 200 kilometers close to Moscow, that means this was an extremely serious threat. And one more thing that Putin has in fact acknowledged here is that there were Russian pilots who have died in this fighting that has happened for about 2-3 days.
And that was very unfortunate. So one Ka-52 attack helicopter went down, killing the pilots. One Il-22 command and control airborne unit, that aircraft went down. We're told in all of the 15 Russian forces dead, apparently more than 10 were pilots.
Yes, and that's something which is very shocking, because it shows the kind of firepower the Wagner Group has, and also the fact that Wagner Group then came out with a statement saying that they did not want to overthrow the government per se or carry out a coup, but wanted to make a statement and punish military leaders. I mean, that is something which leaves a lot of introspection to do, especially for the leadership of Russia. And they said that they wanted to teach a lesson to the Russian military leadership for their failures in Ukraine. So, you know, the fact that the fighting in Ukraine for over 1.5 years now is creating internal problems, strife, and is leading to a civil war kind of a situation begs a lot of questions from the leadership in Moscow.
And this does reflect very poorly if not directly on President Putin, at least on Russia's defense minister, General Sergei Shoigu, and of course General Gerasimov, the chief of general staff, because Prigozhin, he'd repeatedly targeted General Shoigu, the defense minister, and the CGS. In fact, he rubbed their nose to the ground, saying, this is a masterclass. What should have happened in February 2022? The way the Wagner forces reached almost 200 kilometers from Moscow, virtually unchecked. That's the way the Russian forces should have reached Kiev.
That's right, Gaurav. And, you and I were there in Ukraine last year. And we saw how the assault actually started from north of Kiev, from the Belarusian border. And that's something that's I'm not saying it's likely to happen, but a scenario is being set suddenly with the Wagner forces moving to Belarus once again, which is north of Ukraine. And the place where they are getting settlement right now is again about 150 or 200 kilometers from the border.
And they'll just be about 100 miles from Kiev. So does that mean that there is added threat to Kiev from the north?
So that's it.
Or can Prigozhin not be trusted because he and President Putin appear to have fallen out?
Yes, so that's the kind of scenario that is emerging. Will Prigozhin take things in his hand? Will he start to work independently out of Belarus? Will he not take orders of the Russian military, the leadership, while he and his forces work from close to the Ukrainian border on the north? All these are very serious questions, and how this will be dealt with the Russian leadership is something that is still not clear. A civil war might have been stopped in Russia, but what could be the repercussions for the war in Ukraine is something that might not be in the hands of the Russian leadership.
We'll talk about this in greater detail, because what you say is extremely interesting. The Wagner forces have so far done extremely well, not just in 2014 when they were set up, the way they fought in Crimea, but even subsequently the way this private army, a private army that comprises former Spetsnaz commandos, former special forces of Russia and other, whether it's armored or infantry or other forces, including pilots, are working as a private military group, the Wagner forces. We'll talk about that. But a day after this mutiny, this Russian mercenary fighters, the way they almost surged all the way to Moscow, halted their advance only after there was a negotiation. It's being said that this negotiation happened because of, this settlement happened because of Alexander Lukashenko. Alexander Lukashenko is the president of Belarus. It prevented a massive bloodshed, but there was loss of life. The Wagner chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, broke his silence for the first time since this de-escalation. He insists that the aim was not to dethrone or remove President Putin's government, but to send out a message and expose, as he put it, the incompetence of the Russian forces. We get you more in this report.
"48 hours since he led a mutiny against Russia, Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin has broken his silence. He was last seen leaving the city of Rostov-on-Don after suddenly calling off his march to Moscow. Prigozhin now says that a one-day mutiny by his Wagner force was never to overthrow Russian government, but to protest against what he called was its ineffectual conduct of the war in Ukraine.
Наш марш мы начали из-за несправедливости. По дороге на земле мы не убили ни одного солдата. За сутки не дошли всего 200 километров до Москвы, зашли и полностью взяли под контроль город Ростов. Мирные жители были рады нас видеть. Мы показали мастер-класс, каким образом должно было выглядеть 24 февраля 22 года. У нас не было цели свержения существующего режима и законно избранной власти, о чем много раз говорилось. Развернулись мы для того, чтобы не проливать кровь русских солдат.
Remember, Yevgeny Prigozhin had called off the protest, claiming to avert bloodshed of Russians.
Сейчас наступил тот момент, когда кровь может пролиться. Поэтому, понимая всю ответственность за то, что будет пролита русская кровь с одной из сторон, мы разворачиваем свои колонны.
Prigozhin, who has been at the forefront of the Russia-Ukraine war, had launched his protest after a deadly missile strike on his troops. As per Kremlin, Prigozhin will be in exile in Belarus and will not face prosecution.
Вы спросите меня, что будет лично с Пригожиным. Уголовное дело будет прекращено в отношении него. И сам он уйдет в Беларусь.
The situation is said to be stable now in Russia. Moscow too has cancelled counter-terror measures. But the world awaits Vladimir Putin's next move. Bureau Report, India Today.
Abhishek, you heard Prigozhin there. He's now on his way to Belarus or already in Belarus. But what next for the Wagner forces? What next to the person who was once considered very close to President Putin, virtually his chef, delivered everything that the president wanted, whether in Crimea or in other parts of the world. But suddenly, he's persona non grata.
Well, Gaurav, what is very interesting here is, has Prigozhin been punished for his actions, or has he in fact got more autonomy? That's something that I've been thinking, and when you're reading and hearing about what has happened in the last 24 hours, Prigozhin and his entire army, mercenary army, being in Belarus, not being prosecuted, no action against his men who were part of this rebellion. What does that mean? I mean, this is certainly not something that under normal circumstances you would expect a Russian leader to do, because this was clearly treason, taking on your own people, shooting down aircraft. So what has led the Russian leadership to take this decision? Are they under pressure? All these are questions that will be asked. And as we were discussing, what does this mean for the war in Ukraine? If Prigozhin starts to function independently and then at the same time, showing off his successes in eastern Ukraine, then and saying that this is the template how to fight a war, we are not sure if the Russia-Ukraine war will actually be controlled by Russia. It could well end up being controlled by the Wagner Group north of Ukraine.
Should that happen, would this not reflect poorly on President Putin's leadership? If more than 10 pilots have been killed, if at least 15 Russian soldiers have been killed in this mutiny, and yet Prigozhin goes unpunished, Wagner forces are permitted to operate independently out of Belarus, would this not show that these private mercenaries, I mean, one day it's Prigozhin, tomorrow it could be Ramzan Kadyrov and the Chechen forces, they are so strong. The oligarchs are becoming so strong, their private mercenary armies are becoming so strong that the authority of the state is weakened.
That's right, Gaurav. And, one wouldn't expect a professional military like the one that Russia has. It's not a rudimentary kind of a military that they function with. They are extremely professional. They have all the modern, advanced platforms. And remember, when this invasion happened and war started, there were experts who were saying that this war is not going to last long. I believe that there is now a situation, because this war has gone on for so long, there is no clear winner, loser. Yes, there are times when the Russian forces have been able to control a lot of areas where the Ukrainians were sort of trying to fight hard.
Okay.
But the big question has remained that, Russia, even after 1.5 years of fierce fighting, has not been able to ensure that the Ukrainians surrender, they lay down arms. And I think it's this frustration, be it in the Wagner group or perhaps in some other quarters of the Russian military, that could be leading to such incidents happening.
This frustration, I mean, just look at the irony of the situation. Russia is seen as one of the most powerful countries in the world, and it is being said that the morale of the Russian army needs to be improved. It is being said that it's red on red or blue on blue with the Wagner forces taking on the Russian forces. On the other hand, look at Ukraine. 15 months intensely in the line of Russian fire, and the soldiers, at least from images that appear in public domain, Abhishek, they appear to be fighting, and they appear to be fighting to retake some of the territory that's been lost.
That's right, Gaurav. And one more question that comes to mind, and you are actually better placed to answer this. You've covered defense much more than I have. You've been an observer of the Indian military. Isn't it sort of weird that a professional force will need mercenaries to fight alongside? I mean, the Indian army also had used Mukti Bahini. That was more of an intel covert operation. It's not as if Mukti Bahini was supplementing the Indian professional forces on ground. So it sort of baffles me that what was the need for a professional military to use a mercenary group and use them so extensively that you've had a situation that they are bouncing back, and they've picked up arms against that very own military who they were fighting alongside with.
And what does this mean for the leadership? What does this mean for chain of command? What does this mean for General Shoigu? Because Yevgeny Prigozhin has directly and repeatedly attacked Russia's defense minister, General Shoigu, and the chief of general staff of the Russian forces, General Gerasimov. He's alleging that he's not getting the kind of weapons, systems and backup that he requires to take this war even deeper into the Ukrainian camp. But the question is, who is Yevgeny Prigozhin, the chief of the Wagner Group, and what is this Wagner Group? Prigozhin is also known, or at one point of time was known as President Putin's chef. He was considered very close to President Putin. The Wagner Group has been active in Ukraine since 2014, and this mercenary group, it's a private army, PMC as they're called. They comprise some of the best former commandos, former special forces and soldiers of the Russian armed forces. The PMC or the Wagner Group, it's operated extensively in parts of Africa, Central Asia and Latin America. The fighters of this private army are today, even now, at least a large section of them are being hailed as heroes in Russia for fighting against all odds and winning Bakhmut in recent operations. We bring you more in this report.
From Putin's chef to cooking up a global storm with an armed mutiny, Yevgeny Prigozhin finds himself at the center of the attempted coup. Prigozhin is one of Russia's richest and most influential men, but he's had humble roots. He started his business initially as modest hot dog seller in St. Petersburg. He eventually opened a series of chic restaurants, including one on a floating boat called New Island, that became a favorite of another St. Petersburg native, Vladimir Putin. Lucrative state contracts followed, and with time, Prigozhin's activities expanded beyond the kitchen. For instance, in 2012, he won more than 10.5 billion rubles of contracts to provide food to Moscow's schools. However, despite the riches that the food industry brought him, in 2014, he diversified into a new sector, the private military. It is unclear whose idea was it from the Wagner Group, whether Putin asked Prigozhin for help or the latter pitched it to him. Either way, the group came into existence during Russia's 2014 invasion of Crimea. Wagner's success in these early operations led to the group's swift expansion. Wagner became a proxy army for Putin. Subsequently, Wagner Group began to be involved in almost every conflict in the world where Russia had a role to play, from civil wars in Sudan and Libya in Africa to Venezuela during the presidential crisis of 2019. When Putin decided to invade Ukraine in 2022, Prigozhin and his Wagner Group were at the heart of Russian operations. The group benefited Russia significantly. It captured the key regions of Soledar and Bakhmut for Russia. White House officials estimate the private mercenary group employs around 50,000 soldiers. Of those, 40,000 are thought to be convicts, who have been employed from prisons in Russia. What role will Prigozhin and his Wagner Group play now is unclear. Will they mount an assault on Kyiv from Belarus, or will they regroup against Putin? Bureau Report, India Today.
What next for the Wagner Group? There are some reports that seem to indicate, Abhishek, that the Wagner Group may just be wound up. The leader is already in Belarus. The fighters have been given an option. Either join the Russian forces, sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense in Russia, or go to Belarus, or go home.
Well, Gaurav, the offer is very clear that, if you want to stay in Russia, you need to have an agreement with the Russian forces, with the Russian Ministry of Defense. And what that would mean is that they would be then completely under the control of the Russian military. And that's a clear signal that, this was in fact a Frankenstein that the Russians had created for themselves. In 2014, when the Wagner Group started in Crimea, they played an important role. The numbers were barely 5,000, 6,000. Today, they are 50,000 plus. And not just Russia, they've been functioning in African countries. They've been hired by some of the countries to fight insurgencies, terrorism in their country. So clearly they've been picking up some fighting experience as well. And again, a very interesting aspect of how it started, Gaurav. The mercenary groups per se are prohibited in Russia.
Yes.
So then they registered themselves as a company. So it's actually a company that is giving its services in fighting, and that clearly did not go the way Russian forces and the leadership.
They appear to be very well armed. They appear to be armed with surface-to-air missiles, with tanks, with armored personal carriers, with armored fighting vehicles. Infantry seem to have some kind of air power, surface-to-air missiles. All of this seems to indicate that they were armed, and they were armed for quite some time. But will these weapons and systems be used against Ukraine, or have they turned into a Frankenstein's monster, turning on the Russian forces? Now, that remains to be seen in the days and weeks ahead. But Abhishek Bhalla, our team and I will continue to get you much more on this big story. Amidst questions, has President Putin's power been weakened in the long run? Are mercenary forces and mercenaries becoming extremely powerful in Russia? He may have survived today. What next for President Putin? We'll get you more on that story. But that is all I have for you on this special broadcast. Many thanks for watching.